You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
Imagine being born into privilege, but feeling like an outsider in your own family. Arthur Schopenhauer, the so-called philosopher of pessimism, began life in 1788 as the son of a wealthy merchant and a trailblazing author mother. You might think that'd guarantee happiness, right? But for young Arthur, it was anything but. His father's bouts of depression and eventual death-suspected suicide cast a long shadow. Schopenhauer himself admitted he inherited this melancholy, struggling with anxiety, and a sense of not belonging. Now, you may wonder, wasn't his mother a source of comfort? Quite the opposite. Schopenhauer's relationship with her was famously fraught. He even claimed his happiest childhood years were spent away from her. These early emotional wounds bred a distrust of people and a lifelong battle with social connection. The technical term here is familial estrangement, and it set the stage for his later philosophy. Let me put it this way. Schopenhauer's psychological landscape marked by persistent melancholy and social isolation wasn't just background noise. It became the soil in which his entire worldview took root. If you've ever felt like an outsider or sensed the weight of family expectations, Schopenhauer's story might feel eerily familiar. But what did he do with all this pain? He rebelled. When his father died, Arthur broke free from the family business and threw himself into study an act of intellectual defiance that would shape his destiny. So, here's our setup. A young man, haunted by tragedy, choosing the life of the mind over the security of commerce. The seeds of his pessimism and his genius were sown in the very heart of personal loss. Picture a teenager newly liberated from family expectation, attacking his studies like a man possessed. That was Schopenhauer after his father's death. He didn't just dabble, he devoured knowledge. Private lessons, university lectures, you name it. Medicine, philosophy, mathematics, history, physics, astronomy, the list reads like a Renaissance curriculum. Now, you might ask, did he have a specialty? Actually, the technical term here is polymath, someone with expertise across multiple disciplines. Even more impressive, Schopenhauer was a polyglot. Fluent in German, English, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and ancient Greek. It's like he was building a mental Swiss Army knife. Let me tell you a story. His tutors, amazed by his progress, predicted a brilliant future for him as a classical scholar. But there was a twist. The more he studied, the more he became dissatisfied with academic conventions, what he saw as empty abstractions and secondhand learning. Conflict was brewing. Schopenhauer craved knowledge that mattered, knowledge tied to lived experience, not just theory. Sound familiar? How many of us have sat through classes thinking, when will I ever use this? This intellectual intensity and his demand for authenticity would soon set him on a collision course with the philosophical establishment. Let's fast forward to 1813. Schopenhauer secludes himself in the countryside to write his doctoral thesis on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Sounds intimidating, right? But let's break it down. At its core, this treatise asks, why is anything the way it is? The principle of sufficient reason is the technical term for the idea that nothing happens without a cause or justification. If you've ever asked, why did this happen to me? You're echoing Schopenhauer's concern. He identified 4 types of explanations: causal, logical, mathematical, and moral. Here, he's setting up a framework for understanding not just events, but how our minds construct reality. This would become the backbone of his later work. Now imagine Schopenhauer, frustrated by academics who valued abstract reasoning over lived experience. He's asking, can philosophy be more than word games? His answer, yes, if it's rooted in reality, not just logic. So the setup is a classic philosophical conflictrationalism versus existential reflection. Schopenhauer's resolution, anchor philosophy in the real, messy world of human experience. That's where meaning lives. Have you ever read something and thought, wow, this person is speaking directly from the heart? That's how Schopenhauer wanted his philosophy to sound fresh, lived, and deeply personal. He was repelled by academic philosophers who, in his words, acquire their problems conceptually, not existentially. Here's a technical term, existential inquiry, meaning philosophy rooted in the texture of life, not just theory. Schopenhauer's writing style broke the mold concrete, metaphor-rich, and direct. He believed that a philosopher's whole life should be visible in their work. When you read Schopenhauer, he argued, you're not just reading ideas, but encountering a whole man, a whole way of seeing the world. Now, you might be thinking, isn't all philosophy personal? Well, not in Schopenhauer's time. Academic German was notoriously dense and abstract, a kind of intellectual fog. Schopenhauer cut through it with stories, images, and lived wisdom. His approach set up a new paradigm philosophy as autobiography. The conflict between dry abstraction and direct experience was resolved, for Schopenhauer, by making his own life the test case for his ideas. Let me take you to a turning point in Schopenhauer's intellectual life, his encounter with Eastern philosophy. Imagine a young German thinker discovering the Upanishads in Latin translation and falling in love so deeply he'd read a few pages every night before bed. The technical terms here are Brahman, the ultimate reality in Hinduism, and Shunyata, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. These weren't just exotic curiosities for Schopenhauer, they became central to his worldview. He called the Upanishads the consolation of my life and will be that of my death. Powerful, right? These texts introduced him to the idea that our individual selves are illusions, mere waves on the ocean of a deeper, undivided reality. Now, you might be asking, how did this affect his philosophy? Schopenhauer began to see the will, his term for the underlying force of existence, as something akin to the Eastern notion of a universal essence, not just human striving. So here's the resolution. By blending Eastern and Western thought, Schopenhauer opened up new horizons for philosophy, making him a bridge between worlds and a pioneer of cross-cultural wisdom. In 1818, at the age of 30, Schopenhauer published his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation. Think of it as a philosophical symphony in 4 movements covering epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, and ethics. The technical terms here: epistemology, the study of knowledge, and metaphysics, the study of reality beyond the physical, frame his central question. What is the world, and what is our place in it? The book's key insight: the world has 2 sides. On one, it's a representation, the way our minds structure reality. On the other, it's will, a blind, irrational force driving all existence. If you've ever felt like life is a tug-of-war between what you see and what you feel, you're in Schopenhauer's territory. But here's the conflict. Schopenhauer was convinced he'd solved philosophy's oldest riddles, yet his work was largely ignored, at first unsold, unreviewed, unread. Imagine pouring your soul into a masterpiece, only to have the world shrug. The resolution? Schopenhauer's ideas would eventually catch fire, but only after decades of neglect. Sometimes, the world isn't ready for a new vision, at least, not right away. Let's set the stage. Berlin, early 19th century. Hegel is the rock star of philosophy, drawing crowds with his grand theory of the Geist, or world spirit. Meanwhile, Schopenhauer, convinced Hegel is a charlatan, schedules his own lectures at the same time. Here's where the technical terms come in. Hegel's dialectical process, where contradictions resolve into higher truths, and Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. Schopenhauer thought all this was smoke and mirrors, masking empty ideas behind heavy language. The conflict couldn't be clearer. Optimism versus pessimism, abstraction versus experience. Schopenhauer's lectures, almost empty. Hegel's, packed. The humiliation pushed Schopenhauer to abandon academia. You might be thinking, why didn't people see the value in Schopenhauer's ideas? Timing is everything. Sometimes, the deepest truths have to wait for their audience. In the end, the clash with Hegel solidified Schopenhauer's outsider status and his determination to shape philosophy on his own terms. We've reached the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy, the concept of the will. But don't confuse it with conscious desire. This is a technical term for an unconscious, blind, and irrational force at the core of existence. Think of will as a kind of energy that pushes everything, people, animals, even rocks, into restless activity. It's like a tornado inside us, never satisfied, always striving for more. Schopenhauer calls this insatiable appetite. Now, suppose you're wondering, if will is so powerful, does it ever bring us peace? Here's the conflict. Desire is infinite, but fulfillment is always limited. We get what we want only to want something else forever. Schopenhauer uses the myth of Ixion bound to a spinning wheel for eternity to illustrate endless striving. Our intellect, he says, is just the lame man who can see, carried on the back of the blind, powerful will. Resolution? Recognizing the will as the engine of suffering, Schopenhauer sets the stage for his solutions: escape through art, ethics, and asceticism. Let's confront a tough question. Why does life often feel like a never-ending swing between pain and boredom? Schopenhauer's answer is blunt. For every desire fulfilled, 10 more are denied. The technical terms here are negative pleasure, where happiness is just the absence of pain and ennui, that existential boredom when suffering stops. He writes, life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and ennui. As soon as pain stops, boredom sets in. Even pleasure, he argues, is just a brief relief from suffering, not a positive state. Now, you might protest, but what about love, art, achievement? Schopenhauer would say, they're fleeting. Even our greatest joys are shadows, temporary distractions from the underlying misery of restless will. He uses vivid analogies: hedgehogs crowding together for warmth, only to prick each other, or turtles doomed to be devoured by dogs and tigers. Suffering, for Schopenhauer, is baked into the very structure of life. So what's the resolution? Acknowledging suffering is the first step to wisdom. Only by facing life's pain head-on can we begin to look for real escape. With suffering as life's baseline, Schopenhauer sought ways to transcend it. He proposed 3 main strategies: asceticism, aesthetics, and ethics. Let's break these down. Asceticism, the technical term for self-denial, means renouncing desires, even to the point of fasting or solitude. It's radical, and Schopenhauer admitted only a few could endure it. For most of us, there's aesthetics, experiencing art in a will-less state, where we lose ourselves in beauty and forget our striving. He called this will-less contemplation. Ever been so absorbed in music or a painting that you forgot your troubles? That's what he means. Art, especially music, speaks directly to the will, calming its storms. Finally, compassion, the root of Schopenhauer's ethics. When we empathize with another's suffering, we glimpse the illusion of separateness and act with genuine kindness. He saw this as the basis for morality. The conflict is clear. Suffering is inescapable, but through self-discipline, art, and empathy, we can find islands of tranquility in the stormy sea of existence. That's Schopenhauer's bittersweet resolution. So, after a life of isolation, misunderstanding, and eventual acclaim, what's Schopenhauer's legacy? Why does his pessimism still speak to us in the 21st century? First, the technical terms. Philosophical pessimism, the doctrine that suffering outweighs happiness, and existential authenticity, living true to one's experience. Schopenhauer challenges us to look unflinchingly at life's pain, but also to seek depth and meaning despite it. Now, you might be thinking, isn't all this a bit bleak? Maybe, but Schopenhauer's honesty is strangely liberating. He shows us that suffering is universal and offers practical ways: art, compassion, self-understanding to make life bearable, even beautiful. Let me leave you with this. Schopenhauer reminds us that wisdom isn't found in denying pain, but in transforming how we relate to it. Whether you're a student, an artist, or just someone searching for peace, there's a piece of Schopenhauer's hard-won insight waiting for you. So, next time you feel life's pendulum swing, remember, you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find solace in the very struggle that defines us all.